Thank you so much, dear friends, for being here. Thank you so much for being here. It's definitely been a rough last week or two. And thank you for your condolences, or those who were local able to join a Shiva Minyan or whatever you did. Really, it was a great outpouring of love. And if you have no clue what I'm talking about, my mother passed away a week ago. And she struggled with cancer for 9 years. So on some level, it wasn't expected, but on another level, she went very quickly. Once we finally got her into the hospice, she went very quickly. In any case, I'm not here to talk about that, but I'm here to learn Torah with you all. And some people said, "Oh, why don't you take a little break from this?" I said, "No, I need this for me. this, I need this for me. So Torah is healing for me. So thank you all for being in this space with me. And most certainly, my intention is for this learning to be in my mother's memory today and every day, as my first teacher and ongoing teacher in life and in death. And she would want me to most certainly keep going. I studied Torah with her. We studied Psalms together. And she asked me in the hospital towards the end, what's making you happy in your work? And I said, honestly, it's the spaces of learning. There's so much I love, but it's the spaces of learning that drive me. So in that spirit, I'm excited to dive in. And again, just grateful that this is not only an intellectual community here, but also a compassionate community of support. And I felt support from all of you over these last 2 weeks in different ways. So thank you so much. Okay, so friends, here's a poll question for you on Baruch Spinoza. By the way, tangentially, for any of you who were in the kindness class series, the kindness class series was just published after I moved it from class version into book version. And that's in honor of my mother as well. And that is available if you want to, you kind of review some of that, what we were in, the 40 classes on kindness. It can also make a really good gift to a child or a grandchild for them to think about what, to me, is the heart of Judaism, the heart of all religion, the heart of all humanity is really this, us building a more kind world. In any case, God and nature. Option 1, God is nature and no more. Option 2, God is in nature, but also beyond. Option 3, God is not in nature because God is supernatural. Option 4, I don't know. Of course, I don't know can be a part of the first 3 also, because none of us know anything. But this is what we believe and what we feel. So God is nature and no more. God is in nature, but also beyond. God is not in nature because God is supernatural. Or I don't know can also include, I'm not so interested in the God idea, if that's where you're at also. So let's cast our votes there. And Alex, whenever it seems right, you can give us our results. Wow, an overwhelming response. Nobody said God is nature and no more. No one said God is not in nature because God is supernatural. 94% said God is in nature but also beyond. And 6% said I don't know. In any case, pantheism is the view that God is nature but no more. Panentheism, if you add the 2 letters en into pantheism and to make it panentheism, is the category that 94% voted for. That God is everything and in everything, but also beyond everything as we know it, supernatural beyond. So we're going to see why Spinoza is controversial. Of course, he's more than just the ideas we're going to explore, but we will see how this relates. So how how separate are our minds from our bodies? We talked about that with Descartes. How separate is God from the world? Who wrote the Bible? Does God exist at all? These are big questions. Baruch Spinoza is one of the most important Jewish philosophers of all time. Of course, it's controversial to call him a Jewish philosopher. Really, he's a philosopher who's born Jewish, is what we should probably say. But it is fair to say that his influence has been felt more strongly outside of Judaism than inside of it, most certainly. He was willing to go against the accepted beliefs of the Jewish community, which led him to an understanding of God and the Torah that differed vastly from the existing tradition, and eventually caused him to be excommunicated from the Jewish world, right? Not so common to be excommunicated. Big deal. Today, if you're excommunicated, who cares? If you live in Brooklyn, you just get off one, subway stop further and you're in a whole new world, right? But back then, being excommunicated, you had nowhere to go. You joined a different religion or you got nowhere because there is no secular space outside of different religious spaces. Spinoza lived in the 17th century, but his impact on philosophy extends far beyond his time and would serve as the link to the emergence of pantheism in the 19th century. In some ways, it was Spinoza's biggest idea. In pantheism, God and nature are one and the same. They're one and the same, and nothing exists beyond them. All of existence, including our thoughts, must be understood as merely part of the physical world, the result of natural processes, right? This would fit in very well today with the types of scientists who want to argue there is no soul. Why is there no soul? Because you can't locate it anywhere, right? This is actually, according to many scientists, a very unscientific view, because the scientific process means if you can't prove something, then you can't suggest it definitively. So if you can't prove the soul's not there, then you can't scientifically make a claim there is no soul, just like there is no proof of the immateriality of the self, the consciousness. There is really no way yet to locate consciousness within the human brain. So some want to say, well, all we know is the brain, so that's all there is. If you can't find it in the brain, we can't, we have to reject it. But others will say, no, that's very unscientific, right? The fact that you are unable to disprove, the fact that you are unable to locate consciousness, and yet we know consciousness exists, means you can't disqualify consciousness. And thus, it's unscientific to suggest that the soul does not live beyond the body. Some notion of consciousness to exist beyond the body, because we know we're conscious, and yet we can't locate consciousness in the brain. So we can only assume consciousness exists after the body dies. Nonetheless, Spinoza would be in the camp, a camp that I don't want to easily dismiss, that would suggest that all we are is our physical body. All we are is our physical brain. This was a radical departure from the relatively common belief in Spinoza's time that God was distinct from nature and that a spiritual reality existed apart from the world. Before Spinoza, God's relationship to the world was conceived in the same way as the soul's relationship to the body. The two were separate and distinct, even as one serves to animate the other, right? There is God and there's world. There is body and there's soul. The immaterial is separate from the material. This made Spinoza's pantheism hard for religious people to swallow. If God is simply existence as we know it, is there really a God at all? If God is the world and the world is God, what is to distinguish this from atheism, ultimately? Spinoza thought he was a religious person, right? Many people argue he's an atheist because if God is just all we see but nothing more, then what makes it how is that God? But he claimed to be a religious person. Certainly, Spinoza's pantheism denies the possibility of a personal God who cares about us and to whom we can pray. According to the scholar Stephen Nadler, pantheism might sound like a religious position, but Spinoza's view doesn't contain reverence for God, just study of God as nature. To study the plants, to study the human body, to study the cosmos is to study God. Science is God. In fact, there's a gematria, a numerology from the Degel Machne Ephraim, a Hasidic thinker, who says the gematria, the numerology, meaning the numerical value of the Hebrew letters of Elohim, right, God, is the same as Teva. right? That the word for nature has the same numerical value as the word for God. And for a pantheist, there it is, God is nature. But for the panentheist, they say, oh yes, that shows that God is within all nature. Spinoza was also one of the originators of biblical criticism and believed that the Bible can be studied as written by human authors, right? Another really controversial position of the time. Of course, parts of the Bible are human written. Everyone agrees. The Psalms are written by King David, right? The Proverbs are written by King Solomon. Of course, other people will bring in multiple authors here or later authors, but parts of the Tanakh, part of the Hebrew scriptures, everyone agrees are human written, the Song of Songs, that maybe they're divinely inspired. But when it comes to the 5 books of Moses, right, what we call the Torah, right, the T of Tanakh, or the Taf of Tanakh, their traditionalists believe that either this is divinely written or and written by the, written through the hand of Moses, but the word of God. Of course, Deuteronomy is different than the first 4 books. Deuteronomy are the rehashing from Moses. So Deuteronomy has a different status from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. Bereshit, Shemot, Vayikra, Bamidbar has a different status from Devarim. But so this was very controversial for him to suggest all of this is just human authorship. Spinoza wrote, by the way, to sum up by denominations, ultra-Orthodoxy, literally everything's divine. Liberal Orthodoxy has a little bit more of a nuance there around this being from God, but some human partnership involved. Conservative movement classically has argued divinely inspired, but most certainly is kind of conservative movement gives birth to a lot of kind of the biblical criticism. That's why many who went to JTS called it kind of a soulless institution, because rather than studying the Bible for meaning, it was studied historically. And that was really hard for many of the rabbis that came out of there. So there's been kind of a push back against that to kind of look for meaning in text rather than just find its historical origins. And the reform movement, by and large, has kind of embraced the 10 Commandments, but basically accepted the entire human authorship of Torah. Of course, there's nuance within those denominations. That's just kind of a general sense of where that's at. So here's what Spinoza says over here. All these details, the manner of narration, the testimony, and the context of the whole story lead to the plain conclusion that these books were written by another and not by Moses in person. So that's his conclusion over there, and giving birth in many ways to biblical criticism. That's not to say that he doesn't find meaning there. He's a huge Bible scholar. He finds great meaning there, but he is going to challenge the traditional assumptions around authorship. Challenging the authorship of the Torah at that time was a revolutionary act in the world of Jewish thought. Because of his radical beliefs, Spinoza was famously excommunicated by his Jewish community in Amsterdam for unspecified, abominable heresies, is what they called it. And you can read the official letter. If you just Google, Spinoza excommunication letter, you can read the full letter. This was no small act, for it was done at a time when kicking someone out of the Jewish community meant forcing them into an outside world that was hostile towards Jews. Since he didn't become a Christian, most believe, where was he to go? The very idea one could live without religion was almost completely foreign in Spinoza's time. As a younger contemporary of René Descartes, who we learned about together, Spinoza was deeply influenced by him, but also differed from him in significant ways. He rejected Descartes' idea that the mind is separate from the body and that God is separate from nature. Instead, Spinoza was a metaphysical monist. I know that's a very loaded phrase. That means he believed that one substance was the source of all existence, right? All right, let me remind you what's going on here. Descartes, dualism. What's dualism? Two. What's the two? Body, mind, world, God. Two. Spinoza is a monist. One. Everything is one. That's why this feels mystical. Even though it's about nature, not metaphysics, everything is one. God, humanity, nature, everything is one. So, but he's a metaphysical monist. So it's one, and we're going to learn what the metaphysical part is about. he did recognize that the physical world and human thought are not identical. Each one does offer a different perspective on the world, right? The physical world and the realm of thought, the intellectual world, thus making him, here's another big phrase, an attribute dualist. But he did believe that the mental and physical were both the product of a single substance. For example, according to Spinoza, a rock is in essence no different from a human being. They are both made of the same matter. And so Spinoza was still in the realm of metaphysics, but he rejected a theistic metaphysic in favor in a pantheistic metaphysic. Okay, so as a side note, I was recently at the mortuary, and one of the things they're selling these days, and it's not a critique that they're selling it. I mean, it's a business. I mean, people in the death business also have to make money. Although I wish prices were a lot less than they are, and it's very prohibitive. The dying industry. I mean, it's just incredible what it costs. It's really a broader critique. I mean, people have the right to be in a business, and one of the things they were selling in the mortuary room where I met with the woman and gave the obituary and gave my mother's final wishes was post-cremation for those who choose cremation. Of course, you can get ashes, but you can also now get, I don't know how recent this is, if this is decades old or brand new. You can now get the ashes solidified into a rock form for an extra like $2,000, where you can kind of keep the rock in your pocket. Those who want to kind of bring a physical part of their loved one around with them. I said to them, what is left in the ashes? By the way, I can't believe they still call these places crematoria. Post-Holocaust, they say the crematorium is calling, I mean, they got us to call it a cremation company, agency, call it whatever, but crematorium, I mean, post-Holocaust feels so insensitive to me. In any case, you can carry these rocks around with you. And I said, what of the ashes is this of the person? He said, oh, what do you mean? It's just the ashes. I said, yeah, but what are the ashes? They said, well, really, it's the calcium deposits. It's this particular part of the human that cannot be destroyed through fire. That was kind of interesting to think about, what's kind of left. Anyways, back to Spinoza here, who's saying a human is in some sense no different than a rock. Well, certainly in death, this may be true. I mean, once a body's buried, traditional Jewish law, of course, says neither speed up nor slow down the return to the earth. What does slow down mean? Embalmment, right? Mummification. What does speed up? Cremation. There's no mitzvah of kavura bakarka, of burial for Gentiles in Jewish belief. So Judaism is not against cremation for Gentiles, because there is no mitzvah there. But for Jews, and again, I'm not pushing back against anyone here who has chosen embalmment or cremation for themselves, because these are very personal decisions. And in any case, back to Spinoza, this sense that even if there's burial, ultimately the body returns to the earth, right? The body returns to earth. But Spinoza wasn't just talking about in death we're no different than rocks, right? In this world, because we just become, part of the earth. But he meant even in life we are one with the rocks. That's easier for people to feel with trees. If you go to a forest and you meditate with trees, it's gonna be very powerful. You go up to the, what do you call it? The not the redwoods, the red lines. What do you call it up there by Northern California? Somebody put it in the chat. The beautiful, really tall trees that I'm blanking at the moment of what you call that beautiful area of the country where you can meditate with these trees. You could be a tree hugger and hug these trees and really feel the oneness of life. But the rocks might feel a little harder to get there. So while it's difficult to find sources, sequoias, yeah, thank you. While it's difficult to find sources for Spinoza's pantheism in the Jewish tradition, It's not enormously far off from the idea of God as understood by the Kabbalists and Hasidic masters. So it says in Deuteronomy chapter 34, know therefore this day and keep in mind that the Lord alone is God in heaven above and on earth below. There is no other. Ein od milvado. There is no other. And so here we do have this idea that God is on earth, right? There's not some notion of that the divinity is up in the skies, in Shemayim and Olam Haba, but not here. And what does it mean to be here? Is that a presence? Is that physicality? Of course, Christians, by and large, believe that God can exist not only in the physical, but in the flesh of a human being. What do Jews mean and Christians mean when we say that humans are created in the image of God? Do we also mean there's a physical dimension there? Is God within the human being in some sense, in our light, in our physicality, in our souls, right? Or is this just kind of a metaphysical idea? On its surface, this verse seems to mean that there's only one God and not any others. However, a closer reading reveals a deeper interpretation that the totality of existence, the heaven above and the earth below, is nothing other than God. This contention is similar to Spinoza's monism, the notion that everything in the world is simply a different aspect of the same divine substance. Based on this idea, the Kabbalists would come to a similar conclusion to Spinoza and conclude that even a rock is of a divine substance. Born 110 years before Spinoza, the Kabbalist Moshe Cordovero taught, realize that the Ein Sof, the infinite, exists in each existent. Do not say this is a stone and not God. Rather, all existence is God, and the stone is a thing pervaded by divinity. What separates Spinoza is that the world is God and there is nothing more. The Kabbalist perspective, however, maintains that God is within everything, but also beyond, a concept described as panentheism. To understand what this means, we can imagine that in the beginning, God was eternally vast, like an infinite sheet of paper. But God's infinite being left no space for finite creation. Therefore, God contracted God's self, Tzimtzum, and created an empty space into which to create. We can picture the paper having a hole in it. Great find, Alex. And into this hole, God created the world, like a big bang of God's substance. And so while the infinite is in the creation, the infinite also remains outside of it. This is what makes possible to have a relationship with God as something that is not just myself or the sum total of existence. God can reveal God's self to us, what we call revelation, and we can cry out to God in prayer. In Spinoza's model, neither revelation or prayer can exist in any traditional sense, because God is the world and the world is God, but there is no more. So you can't reveal anything if there's no revealer. You can't pray to anyone if there's no outside being. For me, it's difficult to understand why Spinoza's monism would be appealing or sensible as a complete theory of reality for any religious person. But for a secular person, it may be very appealing to embrace Spinoza's idea here. I think we need to reject much of Spinoza's thought as Jews, as he undermines almost the entirety of Judaism. First, his theology essentially eliminates the creation story as we traditionally understand it. If God is in the world, then there can't be a cause to creation that is external to it. Second, revelation is a key element of the Jewish religion. Yet for Spinoza, there is no being outside of nature that can communicate with us. Without revelation, the Torah is no longer divine at all. Third, prayer and divine intervention are completely irrelevant if there is no transcendent God. Why should one pray if there is no one to listen? Accepting the ideas of Spinoza would require changing Judaism into a dramatically different religion. Again, all respect to people who want to embrace him. I think he can be a very meaningful system of thought to embrace. And I think it's all smart and reasonable. Just want to make clear that it really is a radical departure from traditional Judaism, which doesn't make it not fair game to entertain in our session. Our goal here is not to promote a version of Judaism, but to engage in thought together. So what can we like about Spinoza, even if there's some things we might differ from? One possibility is his courage and willingness to go against the accepted wisdom of the community. We can admire his fidelity to philosophy and the world of ideas, even if it meant being outside both the Christian and Jewish worlds, right? Hopefully all of us has the courage to ask big questions. Hopefully we have the courage to be kicked out of community based upon our convictions, based upon our principles. For us to be kicked out would have a much smaller consequence than it did for him, but we can be all the more inspired by being willing to speak truth to power, being willing to stand up for our beliefs in spaces where they're not popular. We can also see Spinoza's pantheism as helping move one towards a more mystical view of God. Rather than view God as cold, abstract, and distant, as is common for rationalism sometimes, Spinoza helps us realize that God is everywhere and found in everything, right? It's not that God created the flower, God is the flower. It's not that I thank God for my capacity to laugh and our ability to cry together. God is in the laughter and in the crying. God is within the emotional experience. Imo nochi batzara, right? God is with a person in their suffering and in their joy, but not just with them as a presence, literally within it. Understanding this can perhaps inspire us to move towards a mystical spirituality that can enable a closer and more intimate relationship with the divine. Spinoza's pantheism may also be helpful for creating a sense of global community by reminding us that we are all one. Maybe there is even some truth to monism, and by recognizing this, we can extend it to the ethical realm by seeing value in all people, animals, and the natural world. To be sure, Spinoza's work was radical and revolutionary, but it was bold, smart, and perhaps not irredeemable. So friends, that's where I'm going to pause with us. And I look forward to hearing from you. And as always, you're welcome to engage with Spinoza or with my views of Spinoza. And you're always welcome to depart to something else that you're thinking about that kind of emerged, because tangents are also wonderful. So, and excuse my scruffiness. I'm not a fan of it, but I'm doing that for a little bit right now. But that's a different conversation. So, okay, so who would, okay, Aglaia, I see your hand up first.
Okay, don't get mad at me, all right? But I'm about to be really, really weird, all right? So I have these kinds of discussions about, well, are you really different from a rock? Are you really different from a cell phone? As you know, with my students, every single semester, the world serves students, and they look at me like I'm absolutely out of my mind. But that's okay. I'm cool with that. However, though, one of the things that I do think about, though, with Spinoza is, all right, well, okay, this is going to sound really weird, though, but okay, all humans, okay, basically, though, would we even exist without God? And so if humans cannot exist without God, and everything that we do, basically, well, everything that we do, can it actually be separated from God at all? So do I have a problem with the idea of thinking as, well, the Torah is written, I think documentary, hypothesis. And then I think, well, there are humans writing this, though. But since God created the humans who wrote all this down, can it actually exist without God at all? So that's where I'm kind of looking at this. All right, I don't know, if there's a good way to put this, though, but Spinoza's not that far off. I mean, I do think that he's a little bit kind of being kind of a jerk when he says nothing. Well, I shouldn't say that, but there is no God beyond this. I mean, I think he's being a little bit too much, though. But at the same time, though, if you look at, traditions like Hinduism or, where, well, technically everything is all part of God's mind anyway. Even these like, minor deities that you have, like these, avatars of, Krishna and everything like that, even they are just reflections of, like whatever God is. And then you think Taoism, well, you have to actually like flow along with life anyway, though, because, well, everything is still part of God anyway. So I don't know, maybe Spinoza's just seeing the same thing in a completely different way, but he is still seeing the same thing. Because, right. Well, yeah, I mean, seriously, though, like even everything that's beyond nature is still part of God, just the same as all of us. I don't know if I'm expressing it well, but yeah, like
great.
Everything, yeah.
Awesome. So great, a lot here. And I also see Ethan's point on the side I'm going to respond to as well. So just to pick up on one of your many great points, Aglaia, on the idea of, well, if humans wrote Torah and God created humans, in some way it can be divine in kind of an interesting, different way. That's an interesting idea that I've never really heard articulated. But here's a similar idea, which I think is also interesting. At the advent of the psychological revolution, think Freud, many said, well, we're not created in the image of God. We created God in our image. And I think they're right. I think they're largely right, because there's really hardly an alternative for most people to do anything other than construct something out of what we have to work with. And so we construct some idea of a God based on what we are and what we know. Whether we construct that God to look like our mother or father, or look like ourselves in some way, or think like ourselves. One of my kids asked me recently, I think it was my 4-year-old, he said, "Is God Jewish?" He said, "Of course not. Of course not. God is not a religion. That's for us to have." And so I can almost imagine it's like a God with payas and a black hat, you know what I mean? It's like, oh God, wearing a tallis, So in any case, yes, of course we construct God in our image, but the Hasidic thinkers say, they flip it then. They say, yes, we construct God in our image, but we construct God in our image from our image of God. And thus it's from a divine place within us that we construct the divine, thus making it true. And so that's kind of an interesting approach also to what Aglaia is saying here of, yes, humans might write ideas, but those ideas come from kind of potentially from a divine origin, thus giving them divinity as well. And what is that kind of meeting space of the human and the divine? Are they overlapping? Are they separate? Think of the art. Think of the famous artwork in the Vatican, of the fingers touching, or trying to come close. Is it pinky? Is it 4 fingers? Forget now. 4 fingers, right? In any case, yeah. So that's a really cool
4
point.
fingers.
And what's that?
I can see it on my wall. It's like 4 fingers. So anyway.
Yeah. Or it's like, there's so many images we can have of touching the divine, but it feels to me like one of them is, if you've ever been in the room when a baby's born, all the more so if it's one of your own or one you love, and you experience that moment and you touch that child for the first time. Feels like, wow, this is a human touching a human, but there's something else going on here in this space. Or if you're holding the hand of someone dying. Yeah, so, but on this topic of nature, people said to me recently, or we've all heard it, death is natural. Death is natural. And I was thinking about that phrase recently. And this is a little controversial, and I'm sorry if this rubs against people the wrong way, but what makes nature good? We assume that when we say something is natural, that makes it good, right? It makes it pure and innocent and virtuous in some sense. It's natural. But just because something natural, right? Does that make it good? And so I want to protest death. I want to accept death too. I want to accept it. Accept death as natural and inevitable and surrender. But I also want to protest it, right? If you've lived a full life and you're dying a natural death, right? There's a surrender, there's an acceptance. I was at the bedside encouraging my mother to accept it, to let go, because that's the gift we give people who have to go, I think. But I'm also there to protest when children are killed, when there's gun violence, when there's war, protest death that is unneeded. And so there's natural death and there's unnatural death. And but this question of nature, and that leads into Ethan's point now of Spinoza and nature and God and evil. If God is nature, then we're going to have to decide, is nature good or not? The conclusions are I mean, a whole lot more than these three. But the three most basic conclusions is either nature is good, right? People who love to hike and feel God in nature might come to such a conclusion that the natural is the holy. Might feel that, people who are interested in homeopathic care and other things like this might feel like the nature is the highest level. Other people might conclude nature is evil. Nature is what has natural disasters. Nature is what produces cancer. Nature is what leads to children being born with only able to live a year in painful existence. And some people might conclude a middle ground, that nature is neither good nor evil. It's like a technology that can be used for good and evil, or that nature has both components within it. In any case, whatever that conclusion is, if God is nature, then that's what God is. Is God benevolent or is God evil? Or is God neither? Is God beyond the categories of human good and evil? These are profound questions. And Spinoza struggled a lot with them. And to be honest, I'm really, having studied Spinoza a lot, I just don't know enough Spinoza to authoritatively say how he worked that issue out. I don't know how he worked that out. And I've read a bunch of things on that. And I think he's really complicated on that issue, on how he views good and evil. So yes, let me pause there to welcome in, yes, Cheryl, and then Gary Friedlander.
When doesn't it say from ashes to ashes, dust to dust?
Yes.
So, I mean, it's already kind of been, whoever you believe wrote that, either God or man or a combination of both. I mean, you're just saying, basically, you're saying that, I mean, I'm saying that this is natural. This is natural is the wrong word. This is the way. It's what we start and we live and we end.
Yes.
And you're just saying that you're not saying that that's a good thing, but then there's the whole thing about, well, the soul lives on forever. So you could say that it's just part of the body that is gone, but your soul lives on forever.
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl. Yeah, I don't want to offer a perspective or a conclusion on this as much as kind of problematize the assumption that the natural is good. And it does feel to me that many natural things are good and worth us submitting to and worth us embracing. So many natural things that we identify, and other things that are problematic. And just not black and white. When should one stop their chemotherapy? Well, that's a really personal decision around how much one is suffering and when they're ready to give in and when they want to protest, and one might say, hey, it's just natural for me to give in now. And another might say, like, I'm going to fight to the end. And there's no right or wrong answer there necessarily. And and one might say, should one take heavy opioids towards the end? I assume most of us think yes. I chose to max out my mother's morphine more than she would have wanted, because she probably would have wanted to be more present, but I just wanted her to have as little pain as possible. And that's not natural. A natural death would be to experience the full pain of it all. It's to use opioids would be less natural, but I choose less natural as good, because I don't think pain is good. Some people think pain is natural and good. What's that, Cheryl?
Okay, I was just going to say, in addition to the human aspect of this that I brought up, I also thought because you mentioned, nature not being great, like when you talk about natural disasters, but so many of the natural disasters have been, I mean, you can believe this or not, I'm assuming you probably do, have been man-made, man-caused, people-caused. I'm not just blaming the guys. Right. So people-caused. Like you were providing for the palliative comfort of your mother. On the other side, humans have done A, B, and C, and X, Y, and Z, and this is a result. These whatever's happening now in our climate is happening in a large part because of that. So
yes. Thank you. I am a big believer exactly in what you just said, that global hunger is not a natural problem. It's a human-made problem. We have enough food to feed all of humanity, and we don't allocate it as such. That climate change, a big chunk of it is hitting more vulnerable populations and caused by more rich populations, and that is human created, at least partially. That even mental health challenges, a lot of the society we've enabled ourselves to produce, leading to increased mental health challenges, is not just natural chemical firings of the brain. They're actually societally influenced. So yes, I'm a big believer in that. Now, if I've never given you one of these coins and you want one or many, come to my office or give me your address and I'll send it to you. Just a reminder on Cheryl, we've all probably heard this idea, but just to remind us. And I had these coins made. On the one side of the coin, it says, Bishvili nivra ha'olam, the world was created for me. And on the other side of the coin, it says, Anochi afar ve'efer, I am dust and ashes. And the wisdom is to know which side to look at each day. When do I need to remind myself that I have infinite value? And when do I need to remind myself that I'm just dust and ashes? And and so on that point, thank you, Cheryl. Anyways, thank you, Cheryl. By the way, one more thing before we go over to Gary Friedlander, then Toby, is that I just want to thank people for being here today, because we have a few more people than usual. And the only conclusion I can come to is not that people were just fascinated by Spinoza, but that a few more people showed up for me today. And so, some of you might have come whatever was going on in my life, and a few of you may have come because you were just being kind. So maybe you all came to be kind. So I think you all came to be kind. But anyways, thank you. So, Gary Friedlander, hi.
Good morning, everyone. Shmuly, it's nice to see you. Can you hear me?
Yes, great.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to, I had a couple things, but just quickly about nature. I don't think nature is good or nature is bad. It just is. And in my feelings or my philosophy is nature, God put us in a natural motion, and we fiddle with it as human beings. And we see the consequences, sometimes good, sometimes bad. And it depends on what side of the fence you're on. If we see a movie in Africa and a lion attacks a zebra, I think we talked about this a few weeks ago, we go, oh, that's horrible, but that's how they live. That's natural. And death on our side is natural. And so I can't say it's good or bad. It just is. And we don't always can understand what happens in nature. It just does. We're still reaching to figure all that out, and as soon as we think we've figured it all out, it blows our philosophy or our thought process. But the two other quick things was, listening to you and have read some Spinoza, but nowhere like you have. It reminds me of a book by Milton Steinberg, As a Driven Leaf, about Elisha ben Abayu. I think that's how you pronounce it. And in his struggle with Judaism and I think it's the Greeks at that time, but he gets excommunicated as well because he has these thoughts that are antithetical to Judaism. But it's a novel. But I don't know if anyone's ever read it or if you've read it, but it's a good read. It makes you think, kind of what we discussed here. And the third thing that I really wanted to say, you talked about prayer. at least in my philosophy, the way I have kind of helpfully figured things out, that God is part of nature as well as in everything else. And he has no ability to, or she has no ability to intervene, because then we go back to nature. So, I pray to God, and I feel that God may listen, but, he can't answer me directly. But he answers me by the textual ways in which man may have been divinely inspired to help answer those questions and lead me in a better purpose of life, not just personally, but for the world. So
beautiful, Gary. Thank you so much. Just a brief reply before we go over to Toby there. Yeah, first on that point of intervention, I mean, we could spend a whole year just studying the various theological beliefs around divine intervention, maximalist approach, minimalist approach, and everything in between. And this notion of God's willingness or ability to respond to anything at all. So thank you for that. And Elisha Ben Avuya, as you mentioned, is generally assumed to be the first kind of Jewish public atheist, as he emerges in the Talmud. And yet, even though there's a challenge to him, there's also a level of respect to him, certainly from Rebbe Meir, who still views him as his teacher, and they respect each other in that. And so that's a great part of our tradition as well. But to your first point, yeah, I mean, on nature, just think about water and fire. Like, water is needed for human survival. You can only live a few days without it. And yet, how many people die from flood? Fire is needed for all society building, and yet fire is part of the tools of destruction. And so that leads to this great philosophical debate today of how much can we and should we manipulate nature? This is one of the great questions of our day. Manipulating DNA, manipulating food, manipulating really virtually everything of what we've inherited, as it leads to GMOs and the like. And I suspect most of us have some degree of contradictory views on this, that some degree of nature we think we can manipulate, and some aspects we say don't play God, right? Some of us will reject that argument of don't play God on some areas and maybe embrace it in others, that there's humans should be empowered towards scientific innovation and medical advancements, and yet also believe there's some limits there. So, okay, over to you, Toby. Thank you, Gary.
Well, Rabbi, you have, as you always do, sort of presaged what I was going to say. I'm a big fan of science. And I don't think God and science are mutually exclusive at all. I think God, whoever that might be, or whatever concept you have of God, provided humans, with a brain to figure stuff out, and gave us the gift of physics, which we have uncovered, and are still in the process of uncovering. I've been reading a lot about Kabbalistic thought, and that creation is continuing, and that it didn't stop with Genesis, that it's a process. Mm-hmm. And we as humans, as feeble as we are constantly uncovering these things, which by their own definition are neither good nor evil. They are things. Like physics is a thing, like nature is a thing. And it's up to us, in our infinite wisdom and consultation with whatever God figure we happen to believe in, to figure out what God's intention for these things are. Mm-hmm. Like how did God want us to use DNA, and what's too far? I love science, and I think as we develop a sense of ethics, and again, Kabbalistic thought being what it is that we are ever and ever increasing our ethical attitudes, or supposedly anyway, that we will come to some sort of ideal of how much of what is ethical. How are we to handle these things ethically? Anyway,
beautiful. Thank you, Toby. And that's a great segue into something that is going to emerge for us later as well, that one of the important realms of ethics in philosophy is distinguishing the is from the ought. the is from the ought. Now, some want to say that we should just live with the is, right? There basically are no ethics, just live with the reality as it is, just embracing everything, not trying to change anything really. But the birth of ethics essentially is that ought is a separate realm from is. I think that relates to science and ethics. Science is what is, and the ought is what we do with what is. So too, as it relates to law, law is separate from ethics. Of course, they can be overlapping, but some people think to be a good person in America means to follow the law. Like, I don't keep my taxes. I don't drive more than 9 miles an hour faster than the limit. I basically, do what the law says, and that makes me decent. But the law can be the opposite of what's ethical. And of course, the ethical can be far beyond what the law tells us to do. And so, and yet we've been taught so much to just, embrace what is, and we're hardwired to embrace what is. And so that's one of our great challenges. And yet I think that religion should not be in tension with science. They're just different realms. The science has its lane, and religion has its lane. And the ideas that scientific findings are going to challenge our notion of religion doesn't really make sense to me. So, all right, let's take one more who hasn't spoken yet, and then we'll pause there for the day. If there's anyone else who wants to jump in on anything. Oh yes, hi Vicky.
I just was going to say it's an interesting discussion, and I think that from what you just said, for me, the whole idea of the lane of religion is this notion of uncertainty, this notion of doubt, this notion of mystery.
Yes.
And things we can't explain, especially when you are dealing with something that's difficult to accept in this life, but it is, and the fact that we're not in control. The two sides of the coin, okay, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, right? There's something very humbling about that, and I think that's also part of religious belief.
Beautiful. I love that, Vicky. And to quote something building off what Vicky said that we shared earlier, if you think life is just a puzzle with a missing piece, you're just looking for the puzzle piece. But if you think life is a wonder and mystery, a problem that can't be solved, it's a very different orientation to live in the world as such. And so thank you for that. And I give everyone here the blessing, and hopefully you give it back to me, that we can continue to live with that wonder and awe and mystery. Sometimes with paradox of contradictory truth, and sometimes outside the realm of what's true, just being with what we encounter, and sometimes judging it as good and evil, because we have to stand up for good and fight evil, and sometimes not labeling it or judging it as good and evil, because all of that is within us and all of that is around us. And sometimes we just exist with the messiness of all of it, whether it's from God or from humans or wherever it's from. Sometimes just submitting to the greatness of all around us that we can't even understand. Have a wonderful day, everyone. So great to be with you all. Thank you so much for joining.